Alright, Standard 8, Substandard C. Describe the nullification crisis and the emergence of states' rights ideology, including the role of John C. Calhoun in the development of sectionalism. Here we see a nullification crisis. In other words, that's going to be one of those north-south tensions that we talked about. I think it's on our list, north-south tensions. And I think the nullification crisis is here. Yep, these are events leading to the Civil War, this nullification crisis. In north-south tensions is sectionalism, this development of sectionalism or the splitting of the country in two. So the focus here is on nullification crisis. We got to define nullification. What does it mean? It's very important for you to know what nullification means. This nullification crisis, as I've told you before, could be an item on the EOCT. And then we need to talk about this states' rights ideology. What in the world is that? You know, let's look at that, and including the role of John C. Calhoun. He's from South Carolina. He's Vice President of the United States at the time. We're going to look at him, and then this development of sectionalism over this issue of nullification. So our standard focus here is on the nullification crisis of 1832. This is an event. This is a concept you need to be very well aware of when you take the EOCT. So let's look at our themes. States' rights ideology versus nationalism or national rights. Let's put national rights. National rights. Alright. So these are political interactions and conflict over the meaning of federalism. You know, we talked about federalism. That's where the national government and the state governments get to share power over us at the same time. Well, you know, as we go along here and we're experimenting with this new government, arguments occur about the relationship between the national government and the state government, so which one has the most power. So we see these political interactions and conflicts and arguments over power between the state governments and the national government. And then John C. Calhoun, political interactions with the president at that time, Andrew Jackson, here. The force bill is going to be part of the conflict, sectionalism, and sectionalism and north-south conflict, north-south tensions, north-south divisions, and then the tariff of 1832 and the tariff of 1828 as well. That's going to be a conflict, and then eventually going to be a compromise. Alright, so what we're dealing here with overall is this issue of national rights versus states' rights, and how this argument contributes to sectionalism or north-south divisions and tensions, splitting of the country in two. So here we are right here, nullification crisis. Okay? Alright. So describe the nullification crisis. That's what we want to do first. Let's describe this nullification crisis and get that out of the way, and then we'll come back and look at states' rights ideology. We'll look at it a little bit now too. Alright, so what is the nullification crisis about? The crisis happened in 1828. First come about in 1828 when the United States government passed a tariff. And it's going to be one of the largest or highest, most expensive tariffs in U.S. history. And a tariff, if we define that, is basically a tax on imported goods. Imports coming into the United States. And these imports coming into the United States, there's a picture. If we bought things from these nations and they were taken to the United States on ships, those would be called imports. Goods coming from other nations to the United States. So these tariffs or taxes on these imported goods were traditionally used to raise government revenue. In other words, money for the government so they could build internal improvements like the Erie Canal or any of the roads, the Federal Road, or eventually railroads, you know, and then eventually paved roads for vehicles. It's going to come later. So, but these tariffs or taxes are going to become used also to protect American industry, manufacturing in the United States from European competition, so or competitors. So if we look at these taxes or these taxes on imported goods, these tariffs, and see how they're going to become very divisive. So we want to look at these tariffs or tax in 1828. One of the largest ones ever was passed. Now, what is a tariff? What do you mean by that? Let's look at an example. Alright, let's say that Great Britain has some cloth that it wants to sell to the United States, and it makes this cloth, and then it's going to cost $4 a roll of this cloth in the United States if we were to buy it from Great Britain. So we can buy this cloth from Great Britain for $4. However, in the United States, somewhere in those industries, those textiles industries we talked about, like Lloyd, Massachusetts, let's say they make cloth the same roll at $4 a roll. Well, you know, what would keep somebody in the South or anywhere else in the West from buying a roll from Great Britain or anywhere else? You know, or what if the American-made cloth was more expensive? What the United States government would do was it would create this tax on this imported good coming from Great Britain. Maybe this cloth is higher quality at the same price. I don't know. But somebody wants to buy this British good. The United States would put a 25% tariff or add a $1 to the price of the British-made good. Now the British-made cloth is going to cost $5 in the United States. So if you're in the United States and you're looking at a shelf and it has a British cloth for $5 and American cloth for $4, naturally you're going to buy the $4 cloth. So this tariff is a way to keep people in the United States buying, cloth that was made in the United States. And a way this $1 is going to go to infrastructure or other types of expenses. So we see here how tariffs work. These tax on imported goods, they have a dual purpose. Number one, protect American industry. Number two, get money for the government. Alright, so Southerners did not like this tariff in 1828. They nicknamed it the Tariff of Abominations, because it's one of the highest in United States history. In record, there was a record high, and Southerners argue that this tariff is unfair, that it's going to benefit these manufacturing companies up north at the expense of southern states. Okay, so this tariff of 1828 is going to cause north-south tensions or sectionalism and split our country apart. It's going to be one of those events. So the tariff of 1828 reveals his sectional thinking about the economy and sectional political thinking about federalism. In other words, the role of the national government in relation to that of the state government, who has the most power in law, in making law and dealing with these things. So arguments over the fairness of the United States government and its actions, this sectionalism is going to occur over this tariff issue. And the Tariff of Abominations in 1828 was one of the highest recorded tariffs up to that time. Okay. Now, John C. Calhoun is the vice president at the time. He is from South Carolina. He was involved in politics in South Carolina and represented South Carolina. He's president of the United States. He and vice president, excuse me. He and the president of the United States, Andrew Jackson, are going to get into an argument. Here's Andrew Jackson here. They're going to get into this argument over this tariff of 1828. The vice president here, he's going to write anonymously this pamphlet called South Carolina Exposition and Protest. Exposition is a writing. Protest, a writing saying they disagree with the tariff of 1828. He's going to argue that the South, his argument was the South was forced to sell cotton to markets throughout the world, and it was unprotected by tariffs by the national government. There were no tariffs on cotton, and that's his argument. And then he said the South had to buy these manufactured goods at extremely high prices while the North is going to benefit from it. So the North is going to benefit at the expense of the South, is what he's saying. Let me see if I can give you a picture or pictorial representation of what I'm talking about. Here's what John C. Calhoun argues. Let's take this example of a shovel. Let's say a shovel made over in France, this French shovel. French business creates this shovel for $2, and it sells it on the market for $2 for this shovel. And let's say that in Massachusetts, at one of these manufacturing places that makes shovels, makes a similar type shovel for $3, $1 more. His argument is this, that the United States government takes this French shovel because it is foreign, and adds, up to $1.50 tax, or this tax on imported goods, this tariff, and it's going to cause this French shovel to become $3.50. Now what the U.S. government is doing here is trying to protect this Massachusetts shovel maker and make sure that it makes money and it's profitable. But if you look at John C. Calhoun's point, he says that a Georgia farmer, somebody in the South, is forced to pay $1 more for a shovel. So they could have bought this shovel for $2. Now, given this choice between $3.50 and $3, they pay $3. In other words, a Southern farmer would rather pay $2 for the French shovel. So he's saying that the Northern manufacturers are going to benefit from this extra dollar, but that Southerners could have purchased the shovel for $2, so it's their dollar that is lost. And I hope you understand this point that I'm trying to make. What John C. Calhoun was saying is that this benefits one section of the country over another. It benefits the North, New England manufacturers, of the agricultural South. So he's saying that this is unconstitutional. And in his South Carolina exposition and protest, he says that the tariff of 1828 is unconstitutional because it favors one section of the nation or region of the United States over another, and it is unconstitutional. It favors the North, the northern region, the northern section, the manufacturing section, over the southern section, the agricultural section. So he says it's unconstitutional, and the state of South Carolina thinks it's unconstitutional. Then in his South Carolina exposition of protest, he argues the theory of nullification. Now, he says that the Union was a compact formed by the states. That's the compact theory, is that the states put the Union together, and it is the states that created the United States. And he says further that if a state perceived a federal law unconstitutional, then that state could nullify or cancel that particular federal law within its state's boundaries, within its state's borders. This argument that he's making is known as states' rights arguments. Now, this argument also goes to federalism. This is an argument over federalism, the practice of or implementation of federalism. Which government has the most power? He's arguing here that states have more power over this law within their boundaries, that they can nullify federal law. This is a states' rights argument. So we turn back here is describe this nullification crisis and the emergence of states' rights ideology. So we're looking at states' rights ideology, or this thinking about states' rights, and this role of John C. Calhoun, how he sets this out in his South Carolina exposition and protest. Now, we're talking about the emergence of it. He didn't come up with this idea. Okay, this idea was already implemented. We're going to talk about it in a few minutes. All right, let's look at nullification as a vocabulary word. What does it mean? This is extremely important. Okay, the definition is the idea or the ideology that states could refuse to enforce a federal law in its borders if it interpreted the law as unconstitutional. And to nullify, the word nullify means to cancel or to revoke. Okay, so the characteristics are when the state of South Carolina refuses to enforce the tariff bill, or cancels the law within its borders, or the law has no force in California, or we're not going to prosecute people who don't follow this law, or the South Carolina is not going to pay the tariff of 1828, these taxes on imported goods. We're not going to do it. Basically what they're saying here. This is nullification. Some examples we've already talked about before, you may have forgotten, were when John Adams was president and he signed into law Alien Sedition Acts that Thomas Jefferson and James Madison believed violated free speech and free press. That if you talked bad about the government or against it or interrupted it, you could be thrown in jail. Or if you're an alien, you could be deported back to your home country. And Thomas Jefferson and James Madison write the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, and in it they argue this nullification theory for the first time. And the action was that the state of Virginia refused enforcement of the Alien and Sedition Acts, and the state of Kentucky refused to enforce the Alien and Sedition Acts. It really didn't become a conflict that caused great argument because by 1801 it had gone away. kind of went away. The law was never reenacted. So some non-examples of nullification are if South Carolina, or in this case Kentucky and Virginia, went ahead and enforced the law or carried out the law as it was made by the federal government. They done as they were instructed, or did what they were instructed to do by the federal government. They obediently did what they were told, as they were told. That were non-examples. So that's nullification. Alright, so what is states' rights ideology? What does that mean? Okay, and the definition of this means the idea that states have more rights and powers than the national government because the states created the national government. Characteristics of states' rights ideology. The states could declare national laws null and void if states considered those laws unconstitutional, and that's null and void within their own borders. Okay. States also could secede from the Union if they wanted to. They had a right to. This is states' rights ideology. And that states were really in ultimate control over slavery. Some examples of this we've already talked about were the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, and now this nullification controversy in 1832 over the tariff of 1828. So these are examples of states' rights ideology. Non-examples are national rights ideology or thinking. And in it, federal laws are the supreme law of the land. And no state can conflict with the federal law, and states had to enforce federal law. And that takes us to that definition. What does the national rights argument say? National rights ideology. The idea that states had to enforce the federal laws, that it was mandated in the Supremacy Clause of the U.S. Constitution. And we read that last time, the Supremacy Clause, that they had to follow federal laws. And the characteristics are, in this argument, they say only the Supreme Court can declare federal laws unconstitutional. And that's a part of federalism that was created in the United States Constitution. And in this argument, the states could not secede from the Union if they wanted to, and that Congress ultimately controlled slavery and the westward expansion of it, and the regulation of slavery. So some examples of national rights would be the court case Marbury versus Madison in 1803, in which under John Marshall as Chief Justice, they ruled that the Constitution gave the Supreme Court, that's the judicial branch, the power of judicial review. And with this judicial review, we mean the power to declare federal laws made by Congress unconstitutional. In other words, states didn't have this power. The Supreme Court had the power to review any law made by Congress and had the power to review it and say if it's constitutional or not. That the states did not have that power. Some non-examples of national rights are that of nullification theory and states' rights ideology. The idea that states could declare national laws null and void. So we see this idea first originates with the Alien and Sedition Acts under John Adams. And these two men here, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, wrote the Virginia-Kentucky resolutions here, saying that the Alien and Sedition Acts violated freedom of speech and press. Since it was unconstitutional, the state of Virginia and the state of Kentucky had a right not to enforce this law. Okay, so states have fundamental rights that the federal government cannot abridge. That's part of the argument. The U.S. Constitution exists as a compact between the federal and state governments, and states can nullify federal laws that they judge to be unconstitutional. This is this idea of states' rights. So South Carolina takes action and in its legislature passes a law of nullification, cancels the tariff of 1828 and 1832, says we're not going to enforce them. And within that law was language refusing to abide by the tariffs or to enforce them. Now, in this, our standard 8C is how does this develop into sectionalism? North-South divisions, North-South tensions. The President of the United States asked Congress for a force bill. And force means he wanted to use force to go to South Carolina and make South Carolina enforce the tariff of 1828 and 1832. Now here's the President of the United States of this national government wanting to go into South Carolina with a military force. He wants to take the army to South Carolina and go into South Carolina, occupy it, and force South Carolina to abide by the national law, the tariff of 1832 and the tariff of 1828. This is an invasion of South Carolina by the national government. If that doesn't tell you we're going to have a civil war coming, I don't know what will. So Andrew Jackson privately says that he when he got there, he was going to hang John C. Calhoun from a tree. Now these are some serious divisions and tensions going on here that were well on their way to becoming a civil war at this time. So what we see here essentially is this national rights argument. Andrew Jackson says he argued that states could not cancel federal law, could not nullify it, and he said that the supremacy law mandates that states enforce every federal law that's made by Congress, and that only the Supreme Court can declare law unconstitutional. This is a national rights, and he says it is my job as commander-in-chief, as president, to enforce the laws made by Congress, and that is exactly what I'm going to do. And that's the national rights argument part of that. So what we have here is this argument, national rights versus states' rights, between John C. Calhoun and Andrew Jackson, between the Vice President of the United States and the President of the United States. He eventually resigns, goes home, and writes South Carolina Exposition Protest in this conflict. In steps the great pacificator, Henry Clay. He works out a compromise where they lower the tariffs lower than they are, and then South Carolina and Calhoun agree to follow by them, agree to enforce them, and then he settles this bitter dispute that's close to civil war, and he comes out as this compromiser, great compromiser, and he settles it, another dispute between the North and the South over these divisive issues. In the end, you could consider that national rights, the conflict ends with the national government overpowering the states. You could say that, and that'd be true. And it could be considered a national rights victory over states' rights ideology. You could say that too. But the issue is far from over. It's far from being settled. We're going to see more arguments over national rights versus states' rights. Alright, so have we met our objective? Have we described the nullification crisis? Yes. Have we talked about the emergence of states' rights ideology? And have we talked about the role of John C. Calhoun in this development of sectionalism? I think we have. Ask questions in class. Good luck on the test. Conflict, North-South tensions, North-South divisions, and then the tariff of 1832 and the tariff of 1828 as well. That's going to be a conflict, and then there's eventually going to be a compromise. Alright, so what we're dealing here with overall is this issue of national rights versus states' rights, and how this argument contributes to sectionalism or north-south divisions and tensions, splitting the country in two. So here we are right here, nullification crisis. Okay? Alright, so describe the nullification crisis. That's what we want to do first. Let's describe this nullification crisis and get that out of the way, and then we'll come back and look at states' rights ideology. We'll look at it a little bit now too. Alright, so what is the nullification crisis about? The crisis happened in 1828. First come about in 1828 when the United States government passed a tariff. And it's going to be one of the largest or highest, most expensive tariffs in U.S. history. And a tariff, if we define that, is basically a tax on imported goods. Imports coming into the United States. And these imports coming into the United States, there's a picture. If we bought things from these nations and they were taken to the United States on ships, those would be called imports. Goods coming from other nations to the United States. So these tariffs or taxes on these imported goods were traditionally used to raise government revenue. In other words, money nullification. What does it mean? It's very important for you to know what nullification means. This nullification crisis, as I told you before, could be an item on the EOCT. And then we need to talk about this states' rights ideology. What in the world is that? You know, let's look at that, and including the role of John C. Calhoun. He's from South Carolina. He's Vice President of the United States at the time. We're going to look at him. And then this development of sectionalism over this issue of nullification. So our standard focus here is on the nullification crisis of 1832. This is an event. This is a concept you need to be very well aware of when you take the EOCT. So let's look at our themes. States' rights ideology versus nationalism or national rights. Let's put national rights. Alright. Standard 8, Substandard C. describe the nullification crisis and the emergence of states' rights ideology, including the role of John C. Calhoun in the development of sectionalism. Here we see a nullification crisis. In other words, that's going to be one of those north-south tensions that we talked about. I think it's on our list, north-south tensions. And I think the nullification crisis is here. Yep, these are events leading to the Civil War, this nullification crisis. In north-south tensions is sectionalism, this development of sectionalism, or the splitting of the country in two. So the focus here is on nullification crisis. We got to define rights. National rights. Alright, so these are political interactions and conflict over the meaning of federalism. You know, we talked about federalism. That's where the national government and the state governments get to share power over us at the same time. Well, you know, as we go along here and we're experimenting with this new government, arguments occur about the relationship between the national government and the state government, so which one has the most power. So we see these political interactions and conflicts and arguments over power between the state governments and the national government. And then John C. Calhoun, political interactions with the president at that time, Andrew Jackson, here. The force bill is going to be part of the conflict, sectionalism, and sectionalism in north-south